Excel allows a variety of information to be stored in individual cells. The basics of what you can store are threefold: formulas, numbers, and text. Now, some people might protest and say that you can store dates and times as well, but those are still simply numbers as far as Excel is concerned. They are displayed as dates and times based on the formatting applied to the cell. When processing information in a worksheet, it is helpful to know what's in the cell. There are actually two ways that you can find out information about what is in a cell: using built-in VBA functions or by using various methods with a range object. Let's take a look at how to use the VBA functions first. VBA provides three primary functions that can be used to determine the characteristics of what is contained within a range or a selection. These functions are normally used to test what is in a variable, but they can also be used to examine the contents of cells in a range. These three functions are isDate, isEmpty, and isNumeric. The isDate function determines whether an expression can be converted to a date or a time. The isEmpty function determines if an expression has ever been initialized or not. The isNumeric function determines if an expression can be evaluated as a number. These functions each return either true or false and can thus be used very easily in testing cell contents. As an example, let's say that you want to check whatever is in cell B9. If it is 0, then you want to color the cell red. If it is anything else, including empty, then you want there to be no color in the cell whatsoever. Now, I've created a macro to do this. It's in the companion workbook for this session. I'm assuming that you have it open on your screen already, but I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the Visual Basic Editor. And you can see that we have Module 1 open on the screen here, and it contains a macro called check for 0. This macro actually checks three conditions: that B9, the cell B9, is not empty. It uses the isEmpty function to do this. That it contains a numeric value. It uses the isNumeric function to do this. And that the cell value is 0. If all three of these conditions are met, then the interior color of cell B9 is set to red. To see how this macro works, let's take a look at the Excel worksheet. I'm going to go back over here, and you'll notice that I have a blank worksheet here. And remember that we're working in this macro with the contents of cell B9. That's what the macro is checking out. Now, I'm not going to place anything into cell B9 yet, but I want to change the color of the cell's interior. So I'm just going to go right up here and we'll just pick a color. I don't care what color. We'll make it green. Now let's go on back over to the Visual Basic Editor. And note that here at the beginning of the macro, before any checking is done, we set the cell's interior color to nothing. The XL none enumeration is used here. It will have no color in it. The macro then does the three checks that I mentioned earlier to determine if the cell should be changed color or not. In this case, the cell itself is empty, so the very first test will return false, which means that the color of the cell won't be changed any further. So let's go ahead and run this. All we have to do is click here. We've now run the macro, and we can switch over to the testing, the worksheet, sheet 1 here, and we can see that cell B9 no longer has the green color in it. This is because the macro removed the color prior to testing the cell contents, and since the cell is empty, the color of the cell wasn't changed to red. Now, I'm going to go ahead at this point and place a 0 into cell B9. So it now has a value in it. That value is, of course, 0 because we just put it in there. And we can go back to the Visual Basic Editor, and you'll note that all three of these conditions should now be satisfied. The cell is not empty. It contains a numeric value, meaning that it doesn't contain text or a formula, and the value that it contains is 0. Thus, when we run this, it should change the color to red. So we run it, and we go back over to this sheet, and sure enough, the cell at B9 has the interior color that has been changed to red, just as we expected. Now, I'm going to go ahead and delete this worksheet since we're done working with it here. And then I'm going to go back over to the Visual Basic Editor. And I want you to understand that the key of this macro is to examine and see how the VBA functions can be used to test the contents of whatever is in a cell. And you can use these three VBA functions that we've been talking about to do those various tests and then make determinations as to how you want to process what is actually in the cells of your worksheets. Excel also provides through VBA a couple of different methods that can be used to determine information about what is stored in a cell. The HAS formula method and the address method. The HAS formula method returns true or false depending upon whether the cell contains a formula. If the range object contains more than a single cell and some of the cells contain formulas and others don't, then the HAS formula method returns a null value. The address method returns the absolute address of the cell or the address of the range of cells. You've seen this address method used in several of the sessions within this course up till now. Now, what I want to do is I want to go over here to the Check Cells worksheet, and you'll see that we have some values to test right down the side here. Over in the Visual Basic Editor, I have a macro that will do the testing. This is in Module 2. This first macro, Check Cells 1, you'll notice that what it does is it sets R equal to the range of cells, A2 through A7. That's the values that we want to test. And then for each cell in that range, it determines the address and stores that address in the saddr variable. It then sets the scont variable equal to nothing and determines if the HAS formula method is set to is true, then it sets scont equal to yes, and then we use the offset method to store that information within the worksheet itself. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and then we can go take a look at the Check Cells worksheet, and you can see that sure enough it put the address of each cell in the address column, and then in the formula column it put whether that particular cell contains a formula or not. Notice that cell A2 contains the value 2, that's not a formula. Cell A3 contains 14, again not a formula. Cell A4 contains a date, not a formula. But cell A5 does contain a formula, that is the result of adding cells A2 and A3. And then down here at the bottom we have another formula which is equal to some text, mynum, plus some formatted value from cell A5. And that's why in the formula column it determined that there was a formula in those cells. Now let's go back over to the Visual Basic Editor, and you'll note that there's a second macro down here called Check Cells 2. In this particular macro, we add in some of the information about the cells that is derived by using VBA functions. You'll notice that we again set the range, we set the range equal this time to A2 through A8. It's one greater than the range we were looking at before. And then for each cell, we set the address, we set the formula, whether it's a formula or not, whether it's a date, whether it's empty or not, whether it is numeric or not, and it puts all of that information within the cells of the worksheet. So let's go ahead and we'll run this, and then if we go back over to Check Cells, you'll see that We have some additional columns that are used in here depending upon what we're testing, but we again have the address, whether it's a formula. This is whether it's a date or not, and this is whether the cell is blank or not, and this is whether the cell is an absolute value that's been entered into that cell. I've actually used the address property in previous sessions of this course, but I didn't go into much of a discussion about its use. In fact, I even used it earlier within this session. You probably noticed that it always returns an absolute value, complete with dollar signs before the row and column notation. The dollar signs or lack of dollar signs is significant if you are working with formulas in Excel itself. In VBA, however, it isn't nearly as significant. Let me show you what I mean. Over here in the Visual Basic Editor, you can see that there's a macro called Fix Addresses. This is in Module 3 of this workbook. And it does a few things. It's a little bit longer than the macros that we've worked with before. It defines a bunch of variables up at the top of the macro, but then it sets some column headings in the various ranges of this worksheet that we're going to be working upon. It then makes those headings bold using the bold property that you learned about earlier in the course. And then it sets the width of those columns equal to the AutoFit property so that they are wide enough to display the titles that we've just put into the headings row. We then put a bottom border on each heading cell so that you can have those cells be underlined, and then we center all of the columns for columns A through E. Finally, we set the range that we're going to be working with, which is range A2 through A7, into the R variable. We then go through each cell within that range, and we basically put we determine some random numbers, and then we put into each of those cells either the random number or a formula that's based upon that random number. Now we're going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and create a worksheet down here so that we can actually do the work within that worksheet. And now I'm going to go ahead and run this macro. And you can see that it's done, and we go back over to the worksheet and you can see what it placed within this table that we had it put together. This is the random value that it created. That's what's here in column A. This is the absolute address that is returned by the address property for that cell. And here we have an absolute formula that includes that absolute address, and then it has a value that's been added to it. In this case, it's a random value that's been added to that cell. This is the relative address that we've created based upon column A. And then this is a formula that uses that relative address over here in column E. Now if we go back over to the macro, you can see that what we have done is right up here we've set the addresses into the ABS ADDR variable and into the REL ADDR variable. The difference between them is that for setting the relative address into the variable, we use the replace function to get rid of any of the dollar signs, and that's why we were able to create the relative address within this macro and then use it within the formulas. One of the most often used informational properties is the count property. This property can be applied to a large number of objects in Excel VBA and is typically associated with collections of objects. For instance, you might use the count property with the worksheets collection to determine the number of worksheets in a workbook, or you might use it with a columns collection to figure out the number of columns in a range. The place that most people don't think of using the count property, however, is with a regular old range object. If used with a range, count returns the number of cells in that range object. This can be very helpful when your code needs to perform different tasks based on the number of cells in the range. Now notice I have open on the screen here Module 4 from the companion workbook, and you'll see that it has a little macro called selection size. All that this macro does is it determines how many cells are within a selection and then takes an action based upon that number of cells. It uses the count property right up here with the selection range object, and if it's equal to 1, then it puts together the proper verbiage in the stemp variable. But if it's not equal to 1, then it sets a different verbiage into the stemp variable, and then finally it displays that information down below. So if over here in this worksheet we have a single cell that's selected, and we go ahead and we run that macro, then we should see that the verbiage says there is one cell in the selected range. But if we go back over here and we select multiple cells and we run that macro, then it should select different verbiage and display it. And sure enough, it tells us that there are 12 cells in the selected range. Again, this is based upon what's returned by the count property for the selection that was made when the macro was first run. In this session, you've discovered how, using the various properties and functions, you can discover information about the characteristics of information stored in your worksheet. Knowing information like this can help you better determine how to process that information using your macros. For instance, you can use the has formula property to guard against adjusting the contents of a cell that contains a formula, adjustments that might otherwise mess up your worksheet. At this point, you may want to take a look at the macros you are starting to develop on your own and see if they could be made more robust by using the properties and functions described in this session.